Okay, so The Grand Beginnings is our exhibition that we have going on at Sama Altoona. It is looking at art history through our permanent collection. And this is everything from, we're really focused on American art here at Southern Alleghany's Museum of Art. That's what we typically collect. And that is often what we show. Now we do some variety, of course, because America's a bit of a melting pot, but we do focus our collection on American art. So this talk today is going to be looking specifically at expansionism and naturalism. And we have a lot of words on the left side there that I want to introduce you to, but they aren't things that you necessarily need to know to understand the art. So Romanticism, naturalism, realism, expansionism, impressionism, all of those isms are going to go into what's happening in the 1800s. We're going to also look at the scalp level school, Mary Cassatt, John Singer Sargent, and then photography's influence. So we're going to start and continue back to this slide that we've touched base on before, that is understanding art history with the who, what, where, why, and how. These influences and impacts that then impact how art is made and how it's understood. So these are social, political, and environmental factors that we're going to continually look at to gauge and see where we are with art. So I'm going to set the scene. So the 1800s, if you were here for the last session, the 1700s, it's really, what does America become? What is considered American? How do we define that? And so when we go into the 1800s, a lot of it is very different. We've now had, a war that's been won. There are more wars that are coming, the War of 1812, American Civil War. And we also start to look at westward expansion. So instead of just the original 13 colonies on that East Coast side, it's looking to move west. And with that comes a whole different set of challenges and issues that you start to see come about. So expansionism and manifest destiny, these had very specific experiences. So manifest destiny was coined, the phrase was coined in 1845, and it's this idea that the United States and the people of the United States were destined by God. Typically, it was based in that religious idea that expanding dominion west was a spiritual and religious obligation. And this then moves the territories further west, as well as this then begins to complicate issues of slavery, like if states come in as free states or as slave states, as well as the genocide and the massacres that were happening with the native populations in the American West. And so all of this is happening continuously through the 1800s. And we're going to see a lot of art that reflects this kind of romantic love of the American Western landscapes. So Albert Bierstadt, this piece is owned by the Gleecrist Museum, but I feel like really expresses how art was being done at this time to really show that landscapes, these beautiful scenes, they make you want to go to that place. And if you're already feeling predetermined by God to go to that place, and then God made it this pretty, you're feeling pretty good about it. So we are looking at this and exploring this, feeling all of these feelings, and this starts to be reproduced throughout the eastern United States to encourage settlers to go further west. And I really want you to start thinking about how art can influence society and how you think or how people might think. So again, when you're looking at these beautiful landscapes, it probably might be a source of pride that you live in a country that's that pretty, that gets that beautiful of light, and those, maybe you're proud of the God or the creator that is part of this manifest destiny. Maybe it's just this idea that that's part of the country you live in. So this is all happening and influencing people and encouraging that westward expansion. Of course, you've got a gold rush, you've got pioneers, you've got cowboys, and you've got all of that that's kind of mixing during the mid 1800s. And of course, then the Civil War breaking out around the same time. This was 1868. So we're kind of in that era as we're looking through this. And one of the most iconic paintings that's owned by the Autry Museum of the American West is this called American Progress. And if you studied this in school, you probably saw this piece in your textbook, because it really hits where American art has been influencing American ideals. So you have this woman who's kind of like a Lady Liberty figure. She's carrying school books, which is kind of this like enlightenment and knowledge, bringing it over the mountains. You know, she's stringing along telegraph wires and bringing railroads and industry over to these more natural places. And so we really see how art, this gets reproduced, you know, replications of this all through American newspapers and different propaganda tools, really, to get people to hop on those wagons, get on those rail cars, and go west. So Romanticism, this was used in the early 19th century to describe this movement of art and literature that was really focused on kind of emotions as opposed to reason. So emphasis on human emotions, and it signified a disillusionment with Enlightenment values of reason and order. And so following the French Revolution, there is this kind of like, oh, if we have order and reason, it'll be great. Like that'll be, you know, honesty and all of this stuff. And so Romanticism was more of the like, it's beautiful and that's good enough. And so as opposed to it's, you know, technically accurate, it could be beautiful and that would be powerful. So naturalism, they're all like very similar, and art history has given them different names over time. So you can, they've meant different things to different people. And so they often called them complicated and vexing in terms of what their definitions are. But for naturalism, it means that it's an artwork that attempts to render reality, but mostly focused on a natural experience. And so it's got that beauty thing that Romanticism has, but is very much based in what the natural world is. And they talked about it having a visual accuracy approaching that of photography, which then kind of ties into realism, which we'll talk about next. But it's a 19th century art movement that sought to depict realistic objects in a natural setting, became one of the major styles of the century, along with realism, and led to the Impressionist movement. And naturalism is often associated with the French plein air practice of painting landscapes outdoors. So if you come to SAMA in 2 or 3 weeks, you'll be able to actually see series of plein air paintings that people made in Blair County recently, which is really exciting. And that's a plein air exhibition. And to be plein air means you take an easel, you take your art supplies, and you go and you sit outside and you paint, you draw, you sketch. But the idea is that the world around you becomes the subject. And often people will either, you know, start and finish that painting in one setting, as opposed to taking it back to the studio to touch it up. But you get actually inspiration from the scene you're in. And this becomes really important because, of course, we're thinking about it. Photography is not really what it's definitely not what it is today, and it's very cumbersome. So to paint landscapes, you're now in the space you're painting. So you're able to get a kind of better read on it. And as opposed to just taking sketches and taking them back, you're doing the whole painting outside. So realism, this is a naturalistic manner. So these titles, they all kind of hold in together, but it's basically artworks painted in a realistic, almost photographic way. And the general attempt to depict subjects truthfully in different forms of the arts. So photography is not really doing what photography you now know does. And I'll show you that in a few minutes. Well, right now. So the birth of photography, this is 1830s that we really see this happen. So 1826, we see this is the first photograph. So this is 1826, it's by Niepce for Niepce. And it takes 8 hours. So this exposure meant the camera was in place for 8 hours. This is the first time that they've really been able to burn light onto anything. It's at the University of Texas, and you probably will never see it because when it's exposed to light, it'll continue to fade over time until we're just looking at a piece of metal. So it's exciting, but we can kind of recognize that there's nothing artistic that we can do from here that's like a realistic, we can't paint this scene. This is looking out the window, and we we can't really, tell where the roofs are. You can kind of get the shape, but we're going to get a much more abstract painting if we base it off of this. So photography is alive, but it's really in its infancy. And I do want to touch on, in 100 years from this photograph, we are here, which is Ansel Adams in the American West photographing in what is a kind of a similar style to the 1860s, 1880s artists were painting. So once photography kind of catches up, we see a big decline in painting being as interested in these styles. So there's these clash of mediums that are going to start to happen as we get closer to the 1900s. Now, the scalp level school is pretty exciting, and especially if you're from the Pennsylvania region, if you're from central PA, it's fun. So in the mid-1800s, there was a group of artists and educators that would come from Pittsburgh. They would take the Pennsylvania Railroad and they would go to Johnstown, and then they would take a wagon to Scalp Level, which is a little town in Pennsylvania, not far from Johnstown, in fact. There it is. So it's just a pretty place. And they would go there and spend the weekend there painting. And this was generally led by artists like George Hetzel, who had spent time at the Hudson River School, which was really the first American fraternity of landscape painting. And George Hetzel, John Hampton, Charles Linford would bring in their students that were students at the Pittsburgh School of Design, which also educated women. And then they would bring these students here. They would have at least 2 or 3 or dozens of outings every year to go out and paint in the natural environment. So it's important to note and be kind of excited that in the 1800s, there were female artists coming in from Pittsburgh to go and paint these landscapes as part of their artistic education, which is really exciting. As we get into artists, so this is George Hetzel. This painting is Woodland Stream. It's on view here at Sama Altoona. So it's 1883, and we have several pieces by scalp level painters in our collection. And one thing I want to note, especially with the late 1800s paintings, is the frames. So these frames are gorgeous, and I hope you get to see them in person because they're really masterful in how they're done. And even how they're repaired is really exciting today because it's a series of casting and layering. It's very cool. So this becomes an important part of the painting as well. Is these are not blank easy frames. These are ornate, masterful frames as well. So this piece, if you get a chance, it's definitely more muted colors, definitely darker. I've kind of zoomed in here because it's really beautiful when you get to see each of the textures and how crisp each part of the painting is. And George Hetzel, he was educated in Dusseldorf, and then he brought that education over to the United States and worked with the Hudson River School artists, as well as teaching in Pittsburgh and working in the scalp level, what was affectionately known as the scalp level school, but was really kind of almost a study abroad in central PA from Pittsburgh. Herman Herzog, similarly educated. We have him in our permanent collection, and this is on display. And this is an untitled landscape, and there's a beautiful bird. You can see it, just like a little dash right there, but it's very detailed. It's very crisp, and his is a little less crisp than Hetzel's, but it's still really beautiful. And he has a whole series of them where he does these kind of more atmospheric paintings. And you can see kind of how at the beginning of this talk, we looked at those Western landscapes. These really start to tie into that visual narrative of how beautiful the natural world is. So, Impressionism. Now, Impressionism might be the word that it's definitely continued to have its moment for centuries, and really didn't take off in the United States in the same way that it did for the European schools. Impressionism developed in France in the 19th century and is based on the practice of painting out of doors and spontaneously on the spot rather than in a studio from sketches. So this is that plein air style again. And a big part of Impressionism was to study light. And so they would go back to the same scenes and paint different lighting conditions. So sunrises, sunsets, what it looked at 2 p.m., what it looked at 3 p.m. And if you like Impressionists, you know that it's Claude Monet, it's Mary Cassatt, it's a whole group of painters in France specifically that did this style. And we're talking about it because though Pittsburgh was the first place that showed Monet, which in the, if you've been to the Carnegie Museum of Art there, they have their International, and they brought in a lot of Impressionist art at the turn of the century. And we are going to talk about Mary Cassatt. And Mary Cassatt, this is the piece of hers that we have on display. It's called the Somber One. And she was the forefront woman artist in Impressionism. And she would be invited to the salons. She was a part of their inner circle. She was best friends with Degas, and she actually had ties to the area. So she often painted women and children, which was also a different kind of study too. She would paint them in their everyday lives. And she did a lot to introduce Americans to Impressionism, to try to bring in her artistic friends into that experience. So the Somber One, this is a kind of early work. So it's kind of considered pre-Impressionistic for her. She went farther into Impressionism as she went on. And she used some of the Dutch and Spanish Baroque painting because it's such a dark palette, which is similar to that style. But she was born in Allegheny City, which is now the north side of Pittsburgh. And she went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and then went to France in 1866, where she studied further. She also, she still had difficulties and prejudice trying to compete in the salon exhibitions that they were having in Paris. So the salon exhibitions would be, they would have, basically it's a juried process, and people would submit their work and then they'd be accepted or not. And so she began exhibiting with the Impressionists because she wasn't kind of getting in with the cool kids. And as we know now, the Impressionists become the cool kids as they move forward. So she really enjoyed Impressionism and her ties to Hollidaysburg. I'm going to read this long excerpt from an article that really dives right into how she got here. So the year was 1871. The place was Hollidaysburg, PA, 70 miles east of Pittsburgh. After 4 years of study in France and 2 celebrated artistic successes at the French Academy's Paris Salon, the 27-year-old artist had been forced out of Europe by the Franco-Prussian War. During her years overseas as a student, Cassatt's family had moved from Philadelphia's urban hubbub to Hollidaysburg, a place where Cassatt had little artistic inspiration, few models, and a desperate need to earn money from her painting. Always passionate about art and confident that she would eventually become an artistic star, Cassatt was ready to quit. She wrote to a friend, "I have given up my studio and have not touched a brush for 6 weeks, nor ever will again until I see some prospect of getting back to Europe." Cassatt eventually shook off her malice and took 2 of her paintings to Pittsburgh. There, Michael Dominic, the Bishop of Pittsburgh, liked her work enough to give her a $300 commission to journey to Italy to copy 2 religious masterpieces for Pittsburgh's new St. Paul's Cathedral. A month later, Cassatt left for Europe and would never again live in the United States. So if you are in the area, this piece is here, and so it's only 10 minutes from where she spent time. Even though she had little artistic inspiration, it did then serve as a jumping off point for her to go back to Europe. And this also is a beautiful example of how environment and context of where the artist is might play a role into what artwork they're making. So she was forced out of Europe by the Franco-Prussian War. So she comes back, she finds herself in rural Pennsylvania and finds herself completely devoid of artistic inspiration, ready to quit. So these are all things that then go into our understanding of this piece of her experience and how she then, moves back and creates a really powerful and impressive body of work. And I do want to share, this is such a cool piece to get up close to. So, when we're looking back here, it just kind of looks like a portrait, but when you get in close, you can see the texture that she puts on the face. It's very different from, more realism painting, and starts to really show her brush strokes are tending towards Impressionism. She's getting a little bit more free with those brush strokes. You can still see, that this is a portrait. You can still see all of the kind of things you would expect, but you see in there, look at those, that's not it's not blended in the way that, we were seeing in the Gilbert Stuart portraits. So this is great if you get to see it, because then you also get to, stare right at this model and go, really looking at the face. And this is a piece that we have also on display. It's a print, but it's made, 100 years later, but it's of Mary Cassatt playing billiards with Edgar Degas. And so that's Degas in the doorway, and her and Degas were best friends. And you can see his iconic paintings of ballet dancers, ballerinas, in the background there. But that shows a little bit of kind of what world she was in. And of course, this has a little bit of elements of surrealism with the billiard balls kind of floating up and down there. But it shows the kind of life she was having in Paris versus maybe a kind of very different life in Hollidaysburg. Now, John Singer Sargent, he was an American artist, but he lived in Italy for most of his life. He was born in Florence to American parents, and he trained in Paris, moved to London, and spent most of his time in Europe. So he is American and has that citizenship, but he was trained and influenced by European art. So there we go. This portrait is what we have on display. It is one of the, it's a beautiful portrait, and what a great mustache. I think we can all agree on that mustache was particularly expressive. This was done in 1915. So we're seeing, the end of the 1800s, that Romanticism, we're seeing the influence of Impressionism, of these different, there we go. These different artistic movements as we get into the 1900s. And we're going to be talking a lot more next time about how the turn of the century really changed American art and really changed art. We're going to be looking at some really exciting artworks too. So this portrait by John Singer Sargent, he was well known for portraits of nobility. He was a great portraitist. And you can see how he ties in with that Mary Cassatt painting. He's one of the most celebrated American artists, especially at the turn of the century. And he has incredible technical skills for the portrait. He was very, very celebrated at the time, and continues to be one of the best American portrait artists ever. So this is very exciting that we have this piece, and you're of course welcome to come and see it. With the turn of the century, American art turns to modernism, exploring new mediums and styles in an increasingly international art market. So what we've seen from a lot of our American artists that have gotten great acclaim was they were actually kind of flip-flopping between America and Europe. They were spending a lot of time in Europe or a lot of time in America. And, we have Herzog and Hetzel, who were spending time getting educated in Europe. So there's a lot more cross-pollination at the start of the 1900s. And we're going to see a shift that you have photography that's able to capture the real world. So what does painting do now? If we have this great tradition of portraits and landscapes, what should painting, what should 2D art look like as we move forward? And that's going to be kind of how we move into modern art, which is the 1900s. So we're going to try to do the 1900s in 30 minutes, like we've been doing these. And of course, we are missing thousands and thousands of artists, and we're focusing on the SAMA permanent collection that's on display here at SAMA Altoona. And we'll look at Dali and Warhol and how all of these artists start to mix and match and become part of the artistic legacy that then leads into contemporary art. So February 22nd, we'll be doing this again. That'll be 12:30. And we'll be looking at modern art, specifically the start of the 1900s all the way through 1999. And I do want to invite you to this Friday, SAMA is hosting a fundraiser called From Italy with Love, where you can try 12 wines and enjoy dinner and drinks and have just a really wonderful time at the casino here in Altoona. So if you're looking to do that, we do have some tickets still available on our website. And if you have any questions, please let us know in the chat. We are available and open Wednesday through Sunday, 12 to 4:30. This exhibition closes March 13th, so you're going to want to see it before then. And if you're looking to see historic paintings of the area, we have that exhibition, the Pamela Patrick White and Bryant White exhibition, opened until February 20th. So you're going to want to see that before then, and then it'll switch over to plein air paintings done during our Community Creates events that we had this past summer and fall. So if you have any questions, please reach out, let us know. Thank you all so much for coming, and we appreciate you and look forward to talking about modern art with you next week. Or sorry, 2 weeks from now. All right, I'm going to stop the share. And then if you have any questions in the chat, oh, thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or message me or put them in the chat. And we appreciate all of your support. Thanks all. Bye.